Let's say the original 12 disciples obeyed Jesus' command to make disciples of their own, and each mentored a new group of 12. Then imagine each of those new 12 were empowered to make 12 of their own, and so on. Within just 4 cycles of disciples making disciples, the original 12 would have multiplied into almost 250,000 disciples of Christ. If each of those 248,832 then went out to make 12 disciples of their own, there would then be 3 million disciples. If each of the 3 million made 12 disciples of their own, there would then be 35 million disciples. If the 35 million did likewise, there would then be 420 million. Imagine 420 million disciples actively going out to impact their communities as Jesus and the first 12 had done. Disciples making disciples making disciples. You can see how Christianity spread like wildfire during the early years of the church. The growth was exponential. And since Jesus proved it only takes 3 years to turn a group of ordinary fishermen and tax collectors into fully trained disciple makers, each one could actually have mentored many groups in their lifetime. Remember how the writer to the Hebrews chastised them for keeping their teaching milky. At least part of the reason for his frustration was that they were slowing down the system of self-replicating discipleship. He says, "You have been believers so long now that you ought to be teaching others." It was expected that believers could eventually be teachers of others, who could be teachers of others, who could be teachers of others. By keeping the teaching milky, they were never maturing to that point. Not only is this kind of growth staggering, but it's also persecution-proof. When Jesus left the earth, he left behind at least 12 disciples to carry on the work. It didn't matter that Jesus had gone in physical body, because the 12 were more than ready to lead themselves. When each of those 12 disciples were dead, they would have left behind at least 12 of their own disciples to carry on the work too, which would be 144 disciples overall. It didn't matter that the 12 had gone in physical body, because the 144 were more than ready to lead as well. Similarly, when any one of those 144 were martyred, they each left behind at least 12 of their own, which is 1,728 disciples overall. It didn't matter that the 144 weren't there in body anymore, because the 1,728 they left behind were more than ready to lead themselves. In other words, every time the authorities came to jail or kill a Christian disciple maker, the work would continue unabated through those he had trained. His disciples would just continue making disciples of their own. It's a bit like the Hydra myth, where the beast couldn't be harmed by violence because every time a head was cut off, several more would appear in its place. Every time a Christian leader is cut off, there should be a legacy of at least 12 who will keep the work going and growing. The constant dissemination of responsibility to others makes the church impervious to violence. Take the buildings and the leaders away, and it won't matter, because there will always be others who know how to lead and disciple. This is why the New Testament church grew in spite of persecution in the first century, and it's why the Chinese church has grown from 2 million to 80 million in the face of persecution today. This is something we must remember then. The goal of a Christian leader is not to create dependent followers who will fall apart without him. The goal of a Christian leader is to do such a good job that he eventually renders himself obsolete. Think of it like parenting. The ultimate goal of a parent is not to create children who will be dependent on the parents for the rest of their lives. That's parental failure. The ultimate goal of a parent is to empower their child with such wisdom and maturity that they can become parents of their own one day, so that they can raise kids who can become parents of their own, and so on. This is the system by which the general population grows, and it should be the system by which the church grows. Don't create followers, create more leaders. This system doesn't just produce unstoppable growth. The small group discipleship format was and remains the most effective method by which to produce deep, strong, enduring and determined faith too. The Master knew what he was doing. These weren't passive pew warmers coming out the other side of this discipleship system. These were people who had been mentored daily, intimately, intensively, and who, as part of their training, had been expected to step out in obedience, putting their faith and reputations on the line for God's kingdom. It was because they had learned by practical application that they quickly became empowered to teach the gospel, defend the faith, make converts, feed the hungry, help the poor, heal the sick, and cast out demons. Jesus' words were not just classroom theory to these disciples. They were experienced veterans who had seen action. In fact, for many of them, faith in those words had often been the difference between life and death. Remember when Jesus sent out the 12 and then the 72? He told them, "Take nothing for your journey. Don't take a walking stick, a traveler's bag, food, money, or even a change of clothes. Wherever you go, stay in the same house until you leave town." The disciples might well have thought, "Whoa now, wait a minute. All these nice ideals you've been telling us about are all very well, but now you're expecting us to put this into action? No money, no food. How are we going to eat? How are we going to survive? Where will we sleep?" The rubber was really hitting the road here. They were about to physically go out into hostile territory with nothing to live on but faith. You can imagine there was a certain amount of trepidation about this before they went. Yet, go they did. And when the 72 returned back to Jesus, you can hear the excitement in their voices. "Lord, even the demons obey us when we use your name." Of course, Jesus had been telling them this all along, but the difference now is that they'd put the theory into practice and experienced it for themselves. You can hear the increased faith in their words. Wow, this actually works. He wasn't just giving us nice-sounding ideals. We did what Jesus told us to do, and it worked. Jesus really is who he says he is. Because they were seeing the reality of Jesus' words in action, their faith soared, and with that increased faith, they were now ready to attempt even greater things. They were slowly turning from lambs into lions. They collectively swept through Asia and Europe with all the power of a tornado. Nothing, but nothing could turn these people back. Indeed, they were turning into the kind of men who would eventually give up their lives for Jesus, all because they were obedient enough to go. Bored, restless, disengaged, these were words that just didn't apply to the early church. Scared? Yes. Persecuted? Yes. Excited? Yes. But life was never dull. They were on a white-knuckle ride which was simultaneously terrifying and thrilling. They were literally changing the world. Much of our restlessness exists simply because we have refused to get on that white-knuckle ride of active practical faith and have instead chosen a safe life of passive inertia. But get on it we must. We must get back to true discipleship. The work of the church must no longer be in the hands of a few professionals at the top of a hierarchy, but must instead be constantly disseminated out to the hands and feet of the entire church, who are empowered and then sent out to act. Church must no longer solely be about formal ceremonies, services, classes, and rituals. Perhaps it must no longer be about any of those things at all. I don't see many of those things in the New Testament. What I do see is a daily way of life where each member is empowered because they have learned, not just by hearing the word, but by being compelled to be doers also. Now, this type of discipleship can only effectively be done in small groups. Just as one married couple can only parent a small number of children effectively before they are spread too thin, and just as one teacher can only teach a small class before they are spread too thin, and just as an army commander can only lead a small platoon of soldiers before he's spread too thin, a Christian leader can only effectively train a small group before he is spread too thin. Jesus demonstrated that if you really want to disciple people, you have to get alongside them, get to know them, develop friendships with them, and develop a bond of trust and accountability with them. It's impossible for one man to effectively disciple a group of hundreds or thousands because it's barely possible for one man to know that many names. So again, the large group needs to be turned into many smaller groups and then responsibility to lead constantly disseminated out. Remember that Peter called all believers a royal priesthood who are all equipped to show others the goodness of God. Under the Old Testament system in Israel, there was a professional priestly class who were appointed to represent God to the people, and everything was centered around them and the temple. But under the New Covenant, we all now have that responsibility to represent God to the world, and we're to go out with it. There should not be this division between clergy and laity in the modern church. As someone once said, the relatively recent invention of layman has only succeeded in producing lame men. As a kingdom of priests, we all have work to do. We all have ways to contribute in accordance with our gifts. In the early history of the church, there was never any suggestion that one could come to watch a show on a Sunday morning every week and do nothing more. That was not church then, and it still isn't church today.